gentlemen, good afternoon. We are ready to present the next speaker on the big stage. We welcome Christian Sloth from NEPCon.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Mom. My name is Christian Sloth and I work for NEPCon. NEPCon is a not-for-profit organization working to promote sustainable business solutions worldwide. We do that primarily by working with industry to responsibly source and produce food products like soy, timber, that's not a food product, but soy, palm oil, and beef. I think the BITE event and the World Food Summit is really showing that there is an interest to think differently about food, to think differently about the story of the food that we eat. So in that way, every bite that we take has a story. And that story can be about different things. It can be about where the food came from, how was it grown, who grew it, were children working on the farm, were trees cut down to make way for the farm, is the food healthy, is the food organic, and so on. So in this way, there's a lot of different aspects of the story of all the food that we eat. So, and it's not just NEPCon that's interested or more interested in these stories. It's also consumers, but also industry is getting increasingly interested in understanding the real story behind the food that is produced and traded worldwide. So, unfortunately, not all these stories that we know about food are positive ones. There's a lot of evidence that the production of especially these commodities like soy and palm oil and beef have negative impacts on environment and the people in the countries where they're grown. So, for example, we know that the expansion of agriculture is the main driver of deforestation or destruction of forest all over the world. We know that approximately 1 hectare of rainforest is cut down every second. That corresponds to 2 football fields, and that is every second that happens. So let's have a closer look at some of these stories about these commodities. The first one here is about soy. This is a soy field in Paraguay, and as you can see, there is not much of the original vegetation left here. Soy production in Latin America has nearly tripled in the last 20 years, and it's expected that the global production will double within the year 2050. It's also estimated that the tropical forest loss because of soy farms is around 500,000 hectares per year. And in 2014, a total of 113 million hectares of land were covered with soy plantations. That is an equivalent of the area of the UK, Germany, and France put together, or the size of 26 Denmarks. So a very significant area is covered by these types of soy fields. So you may be thinking that, well, this doesn't really apply to me. I don't drink soy milk, or I don't like tofu, for example. But really the reality is that 75% of the global production of soy goes into feed for animals like poultry, pigs, cows, and also farmed fish. That means that if you eat meat, you would consume what corresponds to about 61 kilograms of soy each year. And especially interesting for us Danes is to know that it takes about half a kilo of soy to produce just 1 kilo of pork. So a significant amount of soy goes into the production of animals. The next story here is about beef. This picture is of a cattle ranch in the Amazon Basin, and as you can see, what is happening is they cut down the rainforest and they use fire to clear the land, and then they let cattle onto the land afterwards. So it's a very destructive way of clearing land. Not much is left of the original vegetation. So actually, cattle ranching is the main cause of tropical deforestation. It's estimated that cattle farming has been responsible for the destruction of 136 million hectares of tropical rainforest. So if you are counting here, that corresponds to 32 times the size of Denmark. And it's not just about rainforest or trees. Cattle farming and dairy production is estimated to be responsible for about 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions and use about 1/3 of global freshwater resources. So overall, animal agriculture is the leading cause of species extinction, water pollution, and also greenhouse gas emissions. Yep, I know that these stories are quite heavy, but let me just look at one more before getting on to more positive stories. This is a story about palm oil. This photo here is drone footage from West Kalimantan in Indonesia. And here they are preparing the land for new plantations by terracing the hills. Again, a quite destructive way of managing land. You can see there's only one tree left here standing. Palm oil production has been responsible for the clearance of up to 26 million hectares of rainforest, primarily in Indonesia and in Malaysia. That's the size of 6 times the area of Denmark. And this development continues rapidly. Between 1990 and 2013, global production of palm oil have more than quadrupled from 14 million tons to 68 million tons. So you'll probably have heard these stories before, and I know it can be difficult really to relate to the scale and the seriousness of these issues when you hear them, even though you hear them again and again. So what we really would like to convey with this presentation is the scale of this problem. And also I would like to say that for me personally, the first time I really felt the scale of this problem was when I was working in Indonesia on a forest conservation project. When I was flying over Sumatra, an island in Indonesia, all you could see was palm oil plantation after palm oil plantation. So really there you could really grasp the scale of the issue. And you don't even have to go flying a helicopter. If you have ever traveled to Malaysia and landed in Kuala Lumpur, you would have been able to see these plantations in areas that were recently rainforest areas. So, before we get to the kind of our solution to this, what we are working on, another thing that compounds the issues or the difficulties of working with these commodities is the complexity of supply chains. We know that the supply chains of these products are extremely complex, they are long, there are a lot of different actors involved. So let's say you're a supermarket that wants to know where your products come from. You would have to go through probably a long process to map supply chains and map suppliers. Your supplier would be buying from another supplier that would be buying from a trader who would be buying from somebody else. So it's a long supply chain, and it can be very difficult to collect all that information. So this makes it, of course, difficult to access information that allows you to evaluate and address the risks of supply chains and address these issues, and allow you to tell a better story of your products. And even if you were able to track your products to, say, the palm oil farm in Indonesia, you would still have to be able to understand a very complex system of laws and local regulation. For example, in Kalimantan in Indonesia, there are more than 19 different national and state laws that regulate land tenure. So if you can get to know where your material comes from, then you have to understand this context, and that again can be an additional challenge. So we're getting onto the good story here. You may, we all heard these stories, and you may think that I'm, just another NGO that wants to say that these commodities are bad and that you should stop buying them. But that's not really the purpose of what we are trying to do. WWF carried out a study that tried to look at the consequences of boycotting palm oil. And they found that, well, those companies that buy palm oil, they would not actually stop buying oil. They would just buy different oils. And some of those oils would require up to 9 times more land to produce than palm oil, because palm oil is actually a very efficient way of growing plant oil. Also, if we just boycott palm oil, well, it's likely that the palm oil producers, they would not shut down. They will probably continue producing palm oil, but just sell to markets that are less sensitive to these issues than we are in Europe or America or Australia, for example. So, as you have seen on the previous slides, it's easy to find the bad stories, so to speak, but it's much more difficult to know what to do about these bad stories and actually change these bad stories into good ones. But our experience working with the food industry and the timber industry shows us that it can happen, but certain factors have to be in place before this can happen. You have to have the goodwill of the players that are involved. You have to have a market demand for products that are responsibly produced, and you have to have product availability. The producers have to be able to produce responsibly managed products. You also need political structures that support change. So that's governance and legal regulations, for example. But when you have these factors, then change can and will happen. We have seen this actually happen in the 1980s in the timber industry. There was a lot of concern back then with illegal and unsustainable timber harvesting. What happened was that governments, NGOs, and industry worked on these issues, and this culminated in a Rio summit in 1993. Even though there was no binding agreement of this, it brought players together, and it resulted in the industry and civil society of joining forces to create what is called the Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC. Many of you will have known or know this, the timber certification system. So when this started in 1993, it was a revolution in the way that timber was traded and also produced in many of the producer countries. And I think the success continues today. There is around 200 million hectares of forest that is FSC certified. So very successful program, really. There are also other timber certification systems that are doing the same thing. So this has been a very successful approach. However, even though this certification or product certification system has been successful, there has still been ongoing problems with illegal and unsustainable logging. Interpol estimated a few years back that around 30% of global trade in timber was illegal. So that's very significant amounts of timber illegally produced. And that has triggered also a political response, meaning that we now have legal regulations of markets in Europe, the US, and in Australia. So we have seen this development in the timber sector from a civil society and industry solution with certification, but also now with a political and legal solution on regulating markets. And we see the same thing happening now with the palm oil and soy and beef, where there has recently been discussions in the European Commission on implementing similar regulations to what we see with timber for these products. That would mean market regulations for buyers, but also to working on bilateral agreements with producer countries. So there's a demand and a production side measures. So, as I said, we have witnessed also the food industry take some very successful steps towards more responsible sourcing and production. And we now understand our supply chains, or the supply chains for these products, much better than we have in the past. There's been great progress made through product certification, supply chain management, and other efforts to incentivize more responsible production. But historically, the focus has been on single commodities and product certification of single commodities. And we are now at a point where we are catching up to that. And we understand better that in order to be fully efficient in having a responsible supply chain, you need to implement a more holistic approach to your sourcing. What we have been working with in NEPCon is to use what we call a risk-based approach, where we are enabling industry to focus their attention to where the problems are. So, of course, as I said, it's easier said than done to try to change these problems, right? I know that industry has a wide range of responsibilities and priorities when they are sourcing and marketing products. They have to think about food safety, packaging, logistics, pricing, delivery dates, and so on. So also thinking about and evaluating these risks or these stories about what happens actually on the ground at the farm where these products are produced can be extremely difficult for the staff of industry that sits and buys products. It's not something they are usually used to doing. So it's a new challenge for many of them. So one of the themes here of the World Food Summit is food information. And we really believe in NEPCon that information about food is the key to solve some of these issues or be part of that solution. So having information about food production and supply chains will not only allow industry to take informed decisions about what to do about their supply chains, it will also give the industry an ability to tell a good story to the consumers, and it will also allow politicians to make regulations that deal with these complex global markets for agricultural commodities. I talked about a risk-based approach. In NEPCon we have worked for the last 4 years on making information available that would enable such a risk-based approach to work. So, based on the experience we have from the timber industry, we believe that this risk-based approach is the most efficient and effective way to deal with supply chain management. If you want to move away from single products, single certification system approach to a more holistic approach, taking a risk-based due diligence approach is the way that we think is the most efficient way forward. So if we look at what we mean by a risk-based due diligence approach when we talk about food commodities, this is it. It looks quite simple, I know, and on paper it is. But of course there are complexities here that goes beyond this slide. So these 3 steps are basically that you should know what your supply chain looks like. You know, who are your suppliers, where do your products come from, and so on. The next step is about risk assessment. Have to address or assess the risk of, for example, illegal activities in the supply chain, environmental damage in the production, and so on. The last step is about risk mitigation or how to manage risk. And here information is also essential. how are you dealing with the risk that you have identified? For example, what documents could you look at in your supply chain to verify legal origin of your material? So, as you can see, information is really a key to making this successful. And this is exactly what NEPCon has been working on, is to make information publicly and freely available on our new website called the Sourcing Hub. We have 78 country risk assessments that covers timber, palm oil, beef and soy. So, and we also have more than 125 different tools that can guide industry in sourcing and help them to work with their suppliers. This is just a brief overview of the steps you can take when you are using our website. Basically, you can enter the website and you can select your commodity. So let's say you want to look at soy, you click that, and then you are taken to a map where you can select the country where you are sourcing from. And here you can then click that country, and then you will get an overview of the issues, the risk assessments, and the assessment of this information that you will need to start a process for more responsible sourcing. You can also access all the different tools that we have developed on the website. So, if you're interested, you are more than welcome to visit our website, of course. We are also right over here in stand 15. So please come and say hi, and we will be happy to tell you more about the work that we're doing. Finally, I would like to thank our donors who have made this possible, and I would also like to thank you for coming and listening. Thank you.